Good yontif, everyone. For 13,000 years, the place in which the Milwaukee, the Kinnickinnic, and the Menominee Rivers meet Lake Michigan was neutral ground, shared by several tribes of the Algonquin and Winnebago peoples. But soon after, as European immigrants began to settle the lands across the Midwest, the place in which we live was eyed for its rich characteristics, and the period of neutrality came to an end. By the 1820s, Solomon Juneau moved his father-in-law's trading post to the eastern bank of the Milwaukee River. There they founded Juneautown, which began to attract European settlers. Shortly after, Byron Kilbourne arrived on the scene and settled on the west side of the Milwaukee River and established Kilbournetown in direct competition with the settlers of Juneau. Later, in the mid-1830s, a prominent builder, George H. Walker, moved to the region. He built a log house on the south of the Milwaukee River on land that he claimed, and it became known as Walker's Point. Now, for those of you who grew up here, perhaps you know this history, but for those of us who are more recent transplants, like myself, the colorful nature of what happened next is quite the story. These three individuals, known as Milwaukee's founding fathers, and the towns that grew up around them, became bitter rivals. In fact, the rivalry between Juneau and Kilbourne was so intense that when Kilbourne planned the streets of his town, he made sure that the streets running toward the river never aligned with the streets of Juneautown, which is why to this very day, the bridges connecting the two neighborhoods are crooked and not straight across. When Kilbourne distributed maps of the area, he made certain to only show Kilbournetown and told others that the other side was an empty plot. And when steamers began arriving with goods, Kilbourne told them that up the way was only an Indian trading post, which did nothing to encourage trade for the Juneautown residents. In 1839, the village of Milwaukee was officially incorporated, but the animus, the enmity, and mistrust still existed between the neighbors. So much so that control of the riverways started a war between the neighborhoods, a bridge war. Bridges were necessary. They meant life. They were a blessing. But how many and where became the issue of the day. When one town proposed a bridge or began work on a bridge, supplies would go missing, dumped in the river. Plans were stalled until the territorial government of Wisconsin forced these projects forward. By 1845, several contentious bridges were built, 5 in all. Some wanted the bridges, but others thought it impeded the access by boat through the river. On May 3rd, 1845, a schooner captain rammed his vessel into the bridge at Spring Street. Accusations were made by those in the West Ward that this was a deliberate act of sabotage in retaliation for the Westerners' desire to not pay for upkeep. And just days later, the village trustees decided that the bridge at Chestnut had become an insupportable nuisance. The very next morning, the West Warders took it upon themselves to tear down the bridge, and it collapsed into the water. Near violent retaliation took place. The tension was terrible as the trustees voted to take down the bridge at Oneida Street and use its pieces to repair the damaged Spring Street Bridge. But Oneida Bridge was the preferred connection for those of the East Ward, and so on May 28th, armed with rifles and clubs and hammers, the people of Juneautown destroyed the Spring Street Bridge and another small span connecting the two sides. They celebrated by shooting their rifles in the air, and in the days to come after that mob scene, there were assaults in the streets as people strayed into the wrong neighborhoods and spies sent to spread disinformation. This town of 5 bridges tore down every bridge but one. Milwaukee in the early 1800s sounded like the town of Helm. Through it all, one moment stands out. When that first bridge was destroyed, people from Juneautown rose up gathering weapons, including an old cannon loaded with clock weights that they aimed directly at Kilbourne's home. Let me put aside what happened next just for a moment. Today, we live among gleaming bridges, some crooked as the streets still don't always align. Cars and pedestrians, for the most part, safely traverse the water without casting their mind to the colorful past of our city. The names of our neighborhoods and streets and bridges still bear the names of this often forgotten history, but as we move from the physical history of the city to the spiritual roads and bridges of our society, have we truly changed all that much? Let me ask you a question on Yom Kippur, Yom Hadin, this day of judgment. In America, in our Jewish community, are our streets aligned? Are we building bridges, or are we tearing them down? Tomorrow, we will be reading from our sacred Torah, Moses' final speech to the people before they enter into the promised land. He says, Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem. You stand today, all of you, before Adonai your God, your tribal heads, your elders, and your officials, all the people of Israel, your children, your spouses, even the stranger within your camp, from wood chopper to water drawer, to enter into the covenant of the eternal your God. Of particular meaning in this text is that every strata of Israelite society were present, everyone. United in purpose and mission, there are a few moments that give rise to that sense of unity. But what is notable is that even within that unity, there was plurality. This was not merely an agreement between God and the water drawers, or God and the heads of the tribes. This was e pluribus unum, from many one, from many one. There's much that makes us many. Judaism has always had tribes. From its earliest concepts of identity to its long march of history through the Levant, the Near East, through trade routes to North Africa and India and Southern Europe to Western Europe to Eastern Europe, and then onwards to a globalized world. At every stop along the way, in every culture, we built bridges from our ghettos to the outside world. In every land, we were shaped and molded as a people by experience. As we engaged other cultures, our culture changed. It grew and adapted, and for the better. From the Turkish bar music that brought forward the music of Lecha Dodi to the Passover Seder, from challah to matzo ball soup and corned beef, from pescado frito, boyos and gaucha dipped in honey and pickled lemons, Yiddish and klezmer and Ladino, interaction with others brought forward creativity and aided in our survival. Bridges to other cultures enriched our people's lives. And it isn't just the cultural expression of our Jewish identity that finds itself strengthened by pluralism. Our way of thinking, our religious views have been in dialogue for thousands of years. We contend with each other. We argue and fight. Oh, do we fight? We all know the classic joke, 2 Jews and 3 opinions. It's part of our makeup, part of the structure of our people at its very core. There has never been one way of thinking about the world among Jews. Texts of our Torah give voice to the disagreements and dialogues that existed through our earliest experiences. The book of Job argues with the ideas found in the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Ruth argued with the words of Ezra, the scribe, and beyond our Torah, the Talmud records the arguments of our first rabbis and the rabbis that followed in their footsteps. Today, we have Ashkenazi and Sephardic divides. We have Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, humanistic Jewish movements. Among us are Jews who believe in God and those that do not or are unsure. Jewish tradition teaches us, blessed are any disagreements which are l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven, for they will have lasting value. Much like the examples of the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, 2 rabbis and their disciples that lived in the first century with 2 very different ideologies, these 2 schools of thought constantly disagreed. However, our rabbis taught that both views were valid and enduring. One side did not discredit the merits of the other, and both sides preserved the rulings and ideologies of their rival. For the most part, this civility among the Jewish people is endured, for it takes 2 sides to support any bridge. Plurality exists within our community. There may be those who believe that this plurality of thought and idea, the differences in ethnicity or race or culture, are weaknesses to be overcome. But that has not been the case. Plurality has been our strength. That which makes us one from many is not a weakness. It is a bridge to the world. We are a people of bridges. In certain cases, we as a people have been a bridge, a people who have traveled the world and has had the world travel through us. And in America, we found a nation through which the people of the world had arrived and thrived. For in this land, the world arrived under the watchful eyes of Lady Liberty. Finally, in our long history, there was a country that was willing to share in our vision of a bridge-building world, a willingness to build bridges between religions and cultures, people and peoples, to unite the globe within its shores with bridges to span the intolerance of the old. But something has happened. Something has changed. Once again, there is violence and anger in the streets, injustice and fragmented communities. The bridges that allowed us to transcend the ghettos of old are threatened from intolerance and fears of the stranger. And if we, the Jewish people, are a people of bridges, then we have reason for concern. When the marchers in Charlottesville marched with tiki torches in hand and yelled, "Blood and soil, and Jews will not replace us," they were accusing the Jewish people of support for the widow and the orphan and the stranger in our midst, people of every color and religion. Those are the people for whom they are afraid they will be replaced. Last year's high holiday services were the first since the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. I remember the fear of those days, the sadness as we bore witness to the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. The man who perpetrated that attack didn't just hate Jewish people. He murdered so many on that terrible Shabbat morning because for him, we are a symbol of those who have supported the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That's who he hates. I recall it like it was yesterday, those days following the attack, that feeling when we met at Congregation Beth Israel Ner Tamid after the Tree of Life shooting, as we joined hands with people of all faiths, all races, all cultures and communities, our friends and neighbors who crossed rivers and unspoken boundaries to stand with us and comfort us in our time of sadness. Within that room, united in grief for the loss of precious lives with those who stood by our side, this was the only place we could find safety and security and consolation, because e pluribus unum, from many we are one. And so today I say to you and to all who would listen, we seek to build bridges. We seek to build bridges within our community and without, and for that there will always be those who hate us. But I ask you, what is the alternative? Will we be safe if we return to the ghettos? Will we be safe if we stand idly by the blood of our neighbors? Will we be safe if we forsake those who the prophets compelled us to protect? In our Torah portion, nitzavim, this word, nitzavim, is an unusual word for stand. Atem nitzavim hayom, you stand here this day. The typical word is omdim. So what's the difference? Why is it different than nitzavim? According to my classmate, Rabbi Cookie Olshine, the word omed is used when the Israelites stand to accept God's covenant. It is a passive word, indicating standing in a passive form. This differs from the imminent action implied in the verse containing the word nitzavim, in which the Israelites appear coiled to launch themselves across the border. So this word nitzavim, it doesn't just mean stand passively. It means to stand for a purpose. You stand for something this day. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem lifnei Adonai Elohechem. You stand today, all of you, before Adonai your God. Let us not just stand with each other, let us stand for each other. Stand for your tribal heads, for your elders and for your officials, for all the people of Israel, for your children, for your spouses, for even the stranger within your camp, from woodchopper to wooddrawer, and don't stop standing. Stand for your neighbors who are like you and those who are not. Stand for those who fear for their safety and for those who have fled to safety. Stand up for those who would add to the strength of their community if only they were granted the freedoms we hold for ourselves. Stand for families who yearn to be together. Stand up for all those who wish to love the way they love, and in so doing, stand for yourselves. We live in a world in which we are called to take stands for our most firmly held beliefs, but it is difficult to know what stands to take. But today I'm asking you to take a stand, to stand for what our people have believed in for generations and for what they have been shaped to become by history itself. I am asking for you to stand as a bridge. I suspect that each of you is capable in your own way to build a bridge. Some of those bridges will be built within our community when we acknowledge members of our own who have been marginalized because they don't fit the typical ideal of what we expect a Jewish person living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin will look like, or feel like, or believe. Some of those bridges will be built to our greater community when we stand with our neighbors when they are in need, just like we experienced their presence when we were in need. Some of those bridges will be built when we open our hearts and minds and simply talk with those who don't think like us and act like us or look like us. Congregation Shalom is a reflection of our people's Jewish existence. We are a coat of many colors. The fabric of our coat is made up of beautiful faces of people of every different race, ethnicity, culture, nationality, family structure, gender orientation, sexual orientation, and community of origin. We have conservative thinkers, liberal thinkers, and free thinkers. This is what makes us such a beautiful bridge. Let no one tear this bridge to the ground. Milwaukee once tore its bridges to the ground. Perhaps the worst moment of that ordeal was when Juneautown slowly and with great strain wheeled that old cannon loaded with clock weights and took aim directly at Kilbourne's home. Just as the order was being given to fire, someone called out, informing the angry mob that Kilbourne's youngest daughter had just died. The angry mob that just moments ago took aim at this man's home paused from their path of destruction. For who would attack a house in mourning? I imagine that in this moment, those residents of Walker's Point, Kilbourne Town, and Juneautown realized that perhaps their addresses and grievances, their petty differences, and their animus became less important than their shared humanity. The bridges that were torn down were eventually built up again. Soon the town that had 5 bridges, and then 1, returned to having 5 and then more. Walker's Point and Kilbourne Town and Juneautown are simply names that neighborhoods bear, and Milwaukee has become the place that we all live. But not all bridges pass over water. Not all bridges are physical. Some bridges exist to bridge the gap between people, and bridges stand so long as we stand for them. Gemar Chatima Tova.